Hello everyone, welcome to our Module 9 lecture video where we will be talking about delivering your speech. And I know this is a long time coming. When you take a public speaking class, one of the first things you picture is how to give an effective delivery. But as we've talked about, there are 4 important canons of rhetoric that go before the delivery stage. So I hope we've all learned and experienced the importance of those as well. But today we are going to talk about keys to an effective delivery, how to make sure that's possible, and just different tips to help you give the best speech that you can when it comes time to actually deliver it. So jumping in, we're going to talk about the methods of delivery, but first I wanted to go over the 4 keys to an effective delivery. So these are the go-to for what we call again, the essentials of an effective delivery. They are naturalness, enthusiasm, confidence, and directness. So the first one, being natural, we've talked about this before, but it's really just showing your audience that you're human, which you are, and so you're just conveying to them that you're comfortable with what your topic, and they should feel comfortable also. So that's just conveying this through natural gestures, natural facial expressions, and different nonverbal ways that you can do that. And also verbally, don't speak in a way that is completely unnatural or foreign to the audience or even foreign to yourself. Obviously, you want to have a professional way of communicating during a speech, but if it's completely robotic and monotone, that does not seem natural whatsoever. Kind of in that same realm as you want to show your audience enthusiasm. If you are not passionate, or at least faking a little bit of passion for your topic, then there is no way that your audience is going to connect with you or feel that the thing that you're talking about is important or relevant to them. And so you should definitely convey a sense of enthusiasm and passion for what you're speaking of. Again, you can do this through facial expressions and gestures. Inviting gestures show that you are into the topic. Facial expressions show that you're enthusiastic. And you can also do this by vocal tonation and variance. So you don't want to say everything the same, because that sounds robotic and like you're completely bored with what you're speaking about. And so you definitely want to convey that passion that you have for everything that you've researched. You also want to project a sense of confidence. And so we talked about that when we discussed communication apprehension and how that can kind of hinder a little bit of our air of confidence. But really what we mean by confidence here is just that you are proud of the work that you've put into this. You know the material, and so you're going to show that to your audience. So we talked about ways, you could do power poses before you speak, to really give you that sense of pride and accomplishment in your work. And so, again, if the audience thinks that you don't know what you're talking about and you're not confident in yourself, it's really hard to make a connection there. And then finally, engage directly with audience members. So this really has to do with eye contact and specifically engaging with your audience using audience analysis. But this also means that your message needs to be direct. So that can happen with organization and, again, non-verbally with eye contact. Again, that you know what you're talking about and you're conveying that to your audience effectively. So those are the 4 keys to an effective delivery. And now we're going to talk about the 4 basic methods of delivery. So again, I've thrown around these words before we've gotten to this module because they're important, but the 4 are speaking from a manuscript, speaking from memory, impromptu speaking, and speaking extemporaneously. So the first one is speaking from a manuscript, and so this would be if you had written out your speech word for word and you were reading it verbatim, which means, like I said, you're just reading it word for word, you have it all typed out down to the, hello, my name is Meredith Moore. This really restricts your naturalness, especially eye contact and body movement, because obviously if you're staring at your notes or at a piece of paper, it's really hard to look up because you will lose your place. And so that really hurts your naturalness and just your overall effectiveness of delivery. It can limit your vocal expressiveness. If you've ever noticed when you're reading something, you lose a lot of the enthusiasm than if you were just telling your friend a story. And ultimately, it just can be monotonous and boring, like I said. It can sound robotic, it does not sound natural whatsoever, and you lose that connection with the audience when you don't have that eye contact, that enthusiasm, and that naturalness. Memory is formally known as oratory, and so this is if you took your manuscript speech to the next level. So let's say you wrote out a manuscript speech and then you spent the time to memorize every single word in the order that you wrote it and then delivered the speech that way. So this is really difficult to do. We don't do it a lot because it's like I said, it's difficult, and you have to constantly be thinking about your next word as opposed to engaging with the audience. So a lot of the time, if I've seen a student, it's very easy to tell if they've tried to memorize their speech verbatim, is they look up into the corner because they're trying to remember the words that they wrote down, and so they lose, again, that naturalness and that eye contact during their speech. Additionally, it invites danger for a mental lapse. It's very easy to forget what you were going to say, and that creates problems because as opposed to using an outline or something that wasn't written down and memorized verbatim, you can't kind of come up with what you were going to say because you don't know those main points, you just have memorized words. So again, it's really hard to convey enthusiasm for when you're just trying to regurgitate something that's memorized, because all of your attention is drawn to the words, not to your delivery style, your gestures, your facial expressions, or your vocal intonation. And so this may be appropriate for toasts and things like that, although most people for weddings I've been to, they still have a note card or they're speaking extemporaneously. So don't recommend memory, especially for this class, because you will run into problems and it's very easy to tell. Next is impromptu speaking, and so this is unpracticed or improvised speech. So this is a speech that you don't have a lot of time to prepare because it was thrown at you at the last minute. You can try and anticipate some impromptu speech situations. These would be like your boss asks you, hey, we have a conference in 5 minutes. Can you go ahead and prepare something really quickly to just give us an update on your department or something like that. You would have to come up with an impromptu speech because you don't have a lot of time to plan and rehearse. These are usually much shorter. And so it has a lot of the same benefits as extemporaneous speaking because it's usually more conversational and you're still focused on your gestures and your eye contact and things like that. But it can be very nerve-wracking to obviously have to do that impromptu. But this is more situational and something you cannot necessarily predict. And so just knowing that if you have to give an impromptu speech, you can still make a mini outline really quickly and do your best to convey, naturalness, enthusiasm, confidence, and directness to your audience. And finally, the word I've thrown around all semester, that is extemporaneous speaking. So this is the gold standard, especially for what we teach in this class, to help you be the most effective speaker because it does appeal to all 4 of the keys to effective speaking that we've been talking about. And so this actually requires the most preparation and practice to sound natural and enthusiastic and things like that. This would be speaking from an outline, which we have all hopefully looked at and started working on our briefing speeches using that outline. And so this method helps you adapt to the situation, to the audience. It allows you the space to be comfortable and natural and show your passion for the topic. There is a potential for memory lapse because you're using an outline, and so you may forget what your next point is. But we allow note cards in this class, and so as long as you have those note cards, you've practiced your supporting material, you've practiced what your transition words are going to be. I'm a very visual person, so I visualize the outline in my head after doing a lot of practice, and so it's easy to see, okay, I can see the intro, I can see the body, and I can see the conclusion. And I know the order of my main points, and I have practiced enough that I know my supporting material really well. What I would write down on a note card is the specific, statistics and information that's almost impossible to memorize from our supporting material, and you can have that written down on a note card as well. But try not to read these verbatim. I know we have to do a full sentence outline, so it can turn into a manuscript really quickly if you do not practice speaking conversationally, which is really what extemporaneous means, is conversationally with your audience. Okay, next we're going to talk about your voice and delivery. So there are important things to consider when you're giving a speech. It's a little bit different in a mediated space because we do not necessarily have to project our vocals to a specific volume to fit a specific room, but it's still important to speak at a volume that everyone can hear clearly and understand you. It's the most obvious vocal element, so if a speaker is speaking too quietly, I rarely hear people speak too loudly. I don't even know if that is possible for a lot of public speaking situations. Well, it is. Don't shout at your audience. But most of the time people speak too quietly and it's hard for people to hear, and it's very obvious if you're missing information and things like that. It needs to be somewhat louder than normal conversation if you are speaking to a room full of people. Obviously, there are people that are farther away from you that will not be able to hear you at your normal speaking level volume. For a mediated space, make sure all your listeners can hear you. We've all done a great job of supporting each other and telling each other if we cannot hear them, and it's really easy to adjust your microphone on Blackboard Collaborate and your volume. So again, that's a benefit of mediated communication, is it helps us regulate our volume. Next is pitch and intonation, which is something a lot of people I've found don't think about when they're giving their speech. And it's not something that you should be thinking about consciously necessarily when you're talking, but the pitch just means the range of sounds ranging from high to low, and it affects the meaning of spoken words. So obviously, if you say something like, "Grandma made dinner," that is a question as opposed to "Grandma made dinner." That would be a statement. And so in English, the way that we speak with pitch and intonation, that affects the way our message is conveyed. So it's important to know that varying your pitch and your intonation is helpful to communicate not only your message, but to engage your audience. It can become really robotic and monotonous if you have the same pitch and you're what we call monotone. I'm sure you've heard that word before. And so try to avoid being monotone, add some vocal variety, speak again with just enthusiasm, I think will really help your pitch and intonation. But these things are important to consider and to make sure you're not speaking at all one pitch, because that gets really boring. And if you've ever had a class with a teacher who does that, you know just how boring that can be and how quickly it can become unbearable to listen to. Next is the speaking rate. And so this is the pace at which you obviously speak and convey your speech. I don't expect you to necessarily time how many words you speak per minute, but if you want to know, it's normally 120 to 150 words per minute. You want to feed off the audience when you're doing this, because if you're speaking too slowly, you can bore people, and again, you sound like you're droning on, and it's difficult to listen to. But if you're speaking too quickly, which again is way more common than speaking too slowly, it gets confusing, it's hard to follow, and it hurts that naturalness key to effective delivery. It's not natural if you're speaking very rapidly, which again can occur because of nervousness. So take a pause. That's what I always try to do because I naturally speak faster, is to take a pause between sentences. Make sure you don't have run-on sentences, which happens when you're speaking too quickly. And slow down normal than what you think is normal, because I guarantee nerves make people speak faster. And so if you've ever taken a theater class or things like that, they tell you that is speak slower than you think you're speaking, because your audience will be able to connect with you better. As you can tell, I've even slowed down going through this slide because I can notice when I'm speaking quickly. Strategic pausing, I again have mentioned this in some of your comments on your introduction speech, but this pauses help especially when you're nervous or you need to get a point across effectively. It provides a type of punctuation. So if you pause, naturally we assume it's the end of a sentence. We need sentences even when we're speaking orally. It's really easy to have a long run-on strand of sentences without a break. It draws attention to your most important points and your thoughts, so maybe taking a pause after you introduce your thesis and your main points really helps emphasize that those are what are important to pay attention to in this speech. It also allows listeners to contemplate a point, so if you're ever in a lecture, if you ever have me in a lecture in person, I usually have a cup of coffee or a bottle of water in my hand because I feel that if I take a pause and take a drink, it allows people to process the information. It's natural to do that between slides if you're giving a presentation with a slideshow. So don't be afraid to use that as a little trick to make sure you're breathing and to make sure you're not speaking too quickly or confusing the audience. So again, strategic pausing can help you effectively convey a message. We all need punctuation and we all need to breathe. So. Pronunciation and articulation are also important. So we talked about this when we were talking about speaker credibility, but make sure that you pronunciate and articulate your words correctly. Incorrect pronunciation and articulation does distract from the audiences who know how to pronounce that word. Wow, see, I just did it. So make sure that beforehand, if you're using a word that you don't know how to pronounce, think about if you need to use that word or if your audience is going to understand what that word means, because remember, we strive for simplicity. Or B, make sure you look up how to pronounce that word before you begin your speech. So this happened a lot with people when we were talking about rhetoric, and so it is a little distracting for people who pronounce rhetoric, and things like that. So that's just an example of a word to maybe look up before you give a presentation, because again, it adds to your credibility as a speaker. It lets me know that you've at least watched the lecture videos, which is great. So that's just an example. Make sure you're paying attention to how you pronounce words. Now we're going to move on to nonverbal delivery. That's different than our vocal delivery and our voice. So our nonverbals and our body language, I will comment on everyone's in the upcoming speeches. I've already started to in your introduction speeches, but body language, again, is way different in a mediated space than it is in person because we can only see a very small part of your body. So this means that facial expressions and eye contact and eye enthusiasm and facial enthusiasm are way more important than they would be in a live face-to-face context. Gestures, you can still incorporate gestures and they are natural and they help convey points well. Like I talked about signposting before to help the audience get a sense of where you're going with your speech. And just make sure your general body movements convey that confidence and that naturalness and that enthusiasm and that directness that we've talked about. So I would say that facial expressions and eye behavior are two of the most important in a mediated space for our class. But if you're giving a presentation in front of a live audience, make sure that your posture is good, make sure you're not swaying back and forth. That's my main struggle is when I'm standing, or at least when I started off speaking publicly, is I would sway back and forth and I didn't even notice that I was doing it. So watch those tendencies. A lot of times people, I'll do it now, touch their hair when they're nervous, which we can notice in a mediated space. So maybe put your hair back if that bothers you. Another thing is try not to read your notes down because that will cut off that connection with the audience. If you have note cards, I would place them up by your computer so you can glance back and forth to the camera just like you would in a live presentation as well. And don't forget to incorporate some natural gestures that help invite your audience and show them that you're passionate about what you're talking about. So animation, again, this goes back to just a specific form of facial expressions, but smiling is obviously a sign of mutual welcome, which can be the start of a speech. You should always smile at the start of a speech. Mutual comfort and interest, so during the speech, just conveying that, hey, we're on the same page, we're learning this information together, you should care about it because I'm caring about it, and mutual goodwill at the close of the speech, that you wish your audience goodwill. They should, again, care about your call to action or your closing statement. And it does help your confidence. So smiling is contagious, which is a really common cliche phrase, but it is. And so if you're smiling, it's more likely that your audience will have a sense of calm and peace and may also be smiling, and definitely more likely to enjoy what you're saying. And it does help improve your confidence. So if you're down on yourself and you're, not smiling and not engaged, not only does that put a bad taste in the audience's mouth, but it depletes your own confidence. We've talked about this a bunch, but just to go back to how important eye contact is it appeals to that fourth key element to delivery, which is directness. So if you know what you're talking about, you want to show that to your audience, and you want to be as direct as you can with your message. You don't want to beat around the bush, and you don't want to hide behind your note cards or anything else. So eye contact really helps show your audience that you're credible, that you've done the research, and that what you're saying is important and they should listen. It lets people know also that they're recognized. Again, this is harder in a mediated space because we cannot directly look into the eyes of another person. But if you're speaking to an in-person group, make sure to maintain eye contact with every person in the room for at least 3 seconds. And 3 seconds can seem like a long time, so just aim for 2, I always say. But make sure you're looking around the room when you're in a classroom setting, for example, to make sure that your audience is seen, they feel valued. It's a sign, obviously, in our culture of respect, and it shows that you're not just talking to this general group of people, but that you've done your research and that you care about your specific audience that you're speaking to. Physical gestures, again, this is just breaking down those body movements that we talked about. They help fill gaps in your message. They illustrate the size of objects if you ever need to do that. They express the depth of an emotion. Again, they can show that enthusiasm and that passion for a topic if you're using gestures. It should arise from genuine emotions. Don't try to orchestrate gestures besides signposting, which obviously is orchestrated, which is a gesture that's helpful. But you shouldn't try and implant gestures where they seem unnatural, because again, that would hurt your naturalness. And make sure that they conform to your personality. If you are a more shy and reserved person, I don't expect you to have these gregarious, big gestures in your speech, because that's not necessarily conveying who you are. If you are animated and speak like this all the time, that's great, and you can incorporate that as long as it doesn't become, over the top and distract from your message. So make sure, again, that gestures aren't distracting from your message. You want them to add to it and help with pauses and help with emphasis. So just think about it as an extra emphasis to your speech. If you need to convey something important, think about how you would do that if you were talking in person. Again, it's different in a mediated space. I feel like I use less gestures in a mediated space because I feel like you can only see my face, but my hands are right here, and so you can remember to be able to use them. Okay, nonverbal immediacy also refers to I feel like we've talked about this before also, but the perceived physical and psychological closeness that you have with your audience members. If your audience feels like you care about them and you're expressing that you care about them, both non-verbally and verbally, you imply it at least verbally, it makes the listeners respond to your message. It helps them decode the message the way that you meant to encode it, and it honestly helps listeners learn more. There's a lot of research on teacher nonverbal immediacy that we've learned being instructors, and that is that if your students feel that they are cared about, they will actually perform better in the class and they will care about the class more and learn more. And so make sure that your audience feels like they are cared about and that you feel close to them, both physically and psychologically. Again, a mediated space hurts this a little bit, but there are ways to overcome that we've talked about in this presentation. So those gestures, that eye contact, that leaning in when you have something important to say, kind of bridges that gap between our screens and kind of helps us have that physical and psychological closeness. Finally, address. I don't know if this is true for mediated spaces as much as in-person spaces, but normally what we tell our in-person classes is that attire is the first thing your audience notices. It's definitely the first thing that your job interviewer notices when you go to an interview. It's definitely the first thing that people notice if you get up on stage and are performing or speaking. And so it's critical to determine appropriate dress for your presentation. Make sure it fits with the audience's expectations of you and the nature of the speech and occasion. So if you're informing somebody about something that you have done a lot of research on and maybe you're even an expert about, if you're dressed sloppily and your hair's not combed and you look just disheveled in some way, it destroys your credibility in a lot of ways because it just, that's the way we process things as human beings. And I know a lot of you said in your module videos that speaking or dressing up a little bit will help improve your confidence, and it does. Let me tell you, if you dress the way that you want to feel during your speech and a way that you feel proud of, that definitely helps exude confidence, as opposed to if you just throw on leggings and a t-shirt and walk into class like you always do. That doesn't give you the same posture as you would if you were dressed up, because as soon as we put on something nice, we honestly have a different posture about ourselves. So make sure that you determine how you want your audience to see you literally before you give a speech or a presentation. This is especially true with guys in hats. I know a lot of the time guys love their baseball caps, but it does decrease your professionalism, as opposed to if you took it off and combed your hair, you look much more professional, and honestly, your audience finds you more credible. So take that into consideration, even for our speeches. If you want to look a little bit nicer, I guarantee you will feel more confident about yourselves. I know I always do. And so maybe try that for this next speech. But I promise you, especially if you're giving an in-person presentation, that is the first thing that the audience determines about your credibility, is how you're dressed. And finally, I hope you've made it this far, because practice is the most important part of delivery by far. So it's essential, especially when we're doing extemporaneous speaking, like I said. Practicing your transitions, practicing how you're going to inflect, induce style into your speech. That was the wrong word that I wanted to use, but again, practice helps really convey to your audience that you know what you're talking about, you care what you're talking about, and it helps with mental relapses. I find that once you get the organization down, it makes the practice that much easier. So once you have a solid organizational structure, run through your outline. I suggest, and studies suggest, that you do it 7 times at least, that you practice your presentation before giving it, and that is supposed to help you become more natural and more confident, and it helps you focus on what you want to talk about and realize if things aren't working or coming across the right way. Make sure that you're timing each part of your speech also. Again, I've talked about this before, but if your first main point is 2 minutes long and your second main point is 30 seconds, that throws the audience off balance, because we expect main points to be even and to have the same amount of supporting material behind them. So I can't tell you how exactly to practice or what way to best practice for you. I suggest, again, having your outline finished, completed, polished, and then running through it with take out the parts you need for your note card. I do not suggest having your outline and just reading off of it verbatim, like I said, because then it becomes a manuscript. You lose that naturalness and that enthusiasm. And I suggest you practice in a video camera, maybe even in front of a live audience with a video camera, and run through, see how it will look on camera, see if you need to incorporate gestures or if your facial expressions look dull or your eye contact is not coming across. So for this, in a mediated space, practice in the medium that you will be using. So that is all I have for you all today. I hope if you have any questions, you'll let me know. In the realm of outlines, if you want me to look over your outline before you turn it in for a grade, I'm happy to do that. But I don't have anything else for you, so I hope you have a great rest of your day.